Welcome. Glad to have you back. In this presentation, we'll investigate the 62 weeks portion of Daniel 9. If you've gone through the previous presentations, you now know many things which you've likely not heard before. But it's not like this is some private special revelation. These things are all backed up by scripture, by historical data, and by understanding correct grammar and the meaning of words. It's all been there for everyone to see. So why does it feel like this is the first time that someone has ever really recognized these things? I've asked myself this question for many years already. I've come to some conclusions. First, at the risk of sounding too self-important, I think that the time hasn't been right for this prophecy to be interpreted correctly until now. There have been many people who have tried to make sense of the 70 weeks, and there are about as many views and opinions, and everyone thinks that they are correct. But the prophecy has one correct interpretation, and only one. Gabriel instructed Daniel to seal up the prophecy, and Daniel did this. It has caused many people a lot of confusion for centuries. I do believe it was once understood a lot more accurately than it is now. I'm convinced that the reason the Magi knew exactly when to expect the birth of the Jewish Messiah in Israel is due to their correct interpretation of the 62 weeks of years. However, I think how they determined this has been lost to the mists of history. Then, after Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, most people either thought the prophecy had been completely fulfilled, or they allegorized it and discounted any literal fulfillment. This was the state through most of the Middle Ages. With the availability of new translations into languages that people could understand, many started investigating biblical matters for themselves. Archaeological discoveries improved their understanding of ancient history, and people began to consider the prophecy again as possibly having literal fulfillment. However, most people in the English-speaking world who consider themselves experts on Daniel 9 read it according to the King James Version. Those translators added their personal biases into the text and also did not accurately represent the Hebrew grammatical structure of the text. So even into our current modern age, most people do not realize that they have absolutely no hope of correctly understanding the prophecy. They do not realize that they are ignorant of key elements. Now, there could be others who have recognized what I have investigated, but as of this time, I'm not aware of anyone else. For more than 10 years, I've continually sought out the interpretation of others, just to see if what I have discovered is already known. However, with so many people having so many other views and opinions, this correct interpretation just gets lost in all the junk alternatives. But like I said, there can only be one solution, and all the rest are simply wrong. However, most prophecy experts and pastors are not even willing to give my research the time of day and weigh its merits. I do feel this interpretation is one that's correct, but then everyone feels that way about theirs too. But I feel this interpretation is actually unique in that it treats the subject matter absolutely literally. When complete, it will all have historical fulfillment. Second, the years are understood as the common definition of a year. No special prophetic 360-day year is required. Next, Gabriel stated the prophecy is specifically for the Jewish people and for Jerusalem. There is no place where the church fits in or replaces anyone. And finally, the grammar and words of the original language have been meticulously and carefully considered. And there is a reason given for every part of the prophecy. I have not found any other interpretation that can say they meet all four of these requirements. And since they do not, it can be safely stated that they are all incorrect. I do encourage you to continue to investigate and verify all the facts that are here presented. Even though this is the third series that I have released, it required the previous two to lay the foundation of essential information for what is now to be discussed. I won't be able to fully explain all the background information again. If, after this presentation, things do not fully make sense, please go back to the previous presentations on the discovery of the real Jewish calendar and of the date hidden from history to get a more complete explanation. The 70 weeks prophecy is the hub of so many connections. Many seemingly unrelated strands come together to form an elegant structure. I think you will be amazed at what's about to come. I know I was when I first discovered how things fit together. Daniel 9 can be thought of as Daniel's reaction to the massively important and essential prophecy of the 70 years which Jeremiah dealt with extensively. I believe most people truly do not understand the importance of his prophecy. Not only does it form the foundation of the 70 weeks in Daniel, but it is at the heart of Ezekiel's 430-day prophecy as well. That prophecy will be explained in a future presentation. It is the second witness to God's timeline. Multiple places in the Old Testament mention the 70 years found in Jeremiah. Most people consider that it is describing 70 years of Jewish exile in Babylon. As I showed, there is no date of deportation of the population which matches a 70-year period of exile. Instead, Jeremiah specifically states that Babylon was God's instrument of judgment against Judah and all the surrounding nations, and that they will endure a period of 70 years of subjugation. After 70 years, the empire of Babylon will be no more. Babylon became the dominant power in 609 BC. 70 years later, in 539 BC, they were unexpectedly conquered by the Medes and Persians. Around this time, Daniel began to dig into the writings of Jeremiah and realized that the prophesied 70 years for Babylon was over. He saw the promise that God had made that after this time was done, he would allow the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem and to their homeland. He also saw that God had instructed Jeremiah to visit all the surrounding nations with this same prophecy and warning. Daniel realized that God's reputation was at stake if he did not act, and act very soon. Daniel's intercessory prayer outlines the importance to the entire region regarding God's impending response to the 70 years. Gabriel arrives and instructs Daniel to understand the message he has from God. He confirms that Jeremiah contains essential information regarding the 70 years allotted to Babylon. But now, there will be an additional period of 70. This time, 70 weeks of years that are allotted to the Jewish people. Gabriel says this period begins with the announced promise that people will return and rebuild Jerusalem. Daniel had been studying Jeremiah, and the assumption is to go back to his writings and discover when this had been promised by God. God had told Jeremiah to buy some property and place and hide the signed documents into a clay jar as an object lesson that God's promises would be fulfilled. This happened in the year before the destruction of Jerusalem, in 587 BC. From this date, Gabriel states that a period of 70 weeks of years will go by until the arrival of God's anointed, a prince. Cyrus, the king of Persia, is called God's anointed in Isaiah's writings, and he issues a decree that allows the Jews to return and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. And this was in 538 BC, exactly 49 years later. The very significant thing to point out is that Daniel saw the answer to his prayer within his own lifetime. He saw the fulfillment of the first 7 weeks of years. He did understand what Gabriel had said, and he did see the pattern of time that God had laid out for his chosen nation. But that is only the beginning of the prophecy. The 62 weeks of years follows. Now, if we follow what the King James Version says, the 62 weeks immediately follow the first 7 weeks and are added together to form 69 weeks of years. 69 times 7 is 483 years. Since the 7 weeks of years began in 587 BC, when God promised the return to and the rebuilding of Jerusalem, if 483 years is added, that leads to the year of 104 BC. So the question then becomes, is there anything significant about that year? Because Daniel 9:26 states that after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off, leading to the assumption that this would take place quite quickly after that year. But if we consider the prophecy from the other direction, let's evaluate the 6 stated goals for the prophecy. Since the stated goals have not seen complete fulfillment, there is the assumption that a portion of the prophecy is yet for the future. So that means that there is a gap, an unstated period of years between the end of the 62 weeks and the beginning of the final 1 week. But Gabriel separated out 3 distinct periods of years. If there is a gap between the second and third group, then there very might well be a gap between the first and second group as well. So let us examine the original language text in Hebrew to see what can be discovered. Here we see an English translation along with the associated Hebrew text. The first thing that must be said is that Hebrew is read from right to left. So this arrangement is from an English language point of view. This shows the Hebrew words along with the transliteration. The second important point is that we must ignore the capitalization of words and any punctuation, because Hebrew has neither. Now, one does not need to be an expert in Hebrew in order to notice some very significant things. One thing that can be easily seen is that the first section of the 7 weeks, the 2 words shub and bana are used. In the previous presentation, we investigated these significant words as they are the keys to know when the entire timeline started. God used these same 2 words in Jeremiah's prophecy spoken in 587 BC. But notice these 2 words are also used in the next section of the 62 weeks portion. However, the English translation chose to translate shub as the word again instead of restore. So here is an example that looking at the original Hebrew shows us things that the English language does not. Next, let's consider the conjunction and. Since Hebrew does not have punctuation, words like and but serve as a very important way to separate subjects and changes of thought. A very good explanation about this is found in the included link. In this transliteration, see the forward slashes that separate the words? In Hebrew, conjunctions are added to words so that they appear as a single word. But here they are separated like this so that this becomes obvious that they are additions. That vav character that looks a little like a 7 is the word for and. At the very beginning of the verse, there is an and. And no is a new change of subject. Then notice that and is used in the next word to connect understand. It says know and understand. But see in the English translation, it specifically includes an and between 7 weeks and 62 weeks. However, in the Hebrew, there is actually no and. No conjunction exists. The translators have added that extra and where the Hebrew does not have it. This changes the entire meaning of this section. Here is the first gap. There is no and. There is a definite break between the previous section of 7 weeks and the next section of 62 weeks. There is a gap of years that is unstated. But both sections have a relationship by the use of the same two words, shub and bana. The first 7 weeks are related only to the issuing of the promise of the restoring and rebuilding. The second 62 weeks are when the actual restoring and rebuilding will take place. It specifically mentions street or plaza and wall or rampart. It deals with the city structures as opposed to only the temple. So the 62 weeks begins when the city proper sees restoration. And this did not happen with the decree of Cyrus. Only the temple foundations were initially laid during his reign. The city itself would have to wait until Nehemiah for the connection to the start of the 62 weeks. Nehemiah was cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes and received a report about the current state of Jerusalem. The remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are destroyed by fire. Nehemiah 1 verse 3. Later, even after the point when the city walls had just been rebuilt, Nehemiah states that the city inside was still in ruin. The city was wide and large, but the people within it were very few, and no houses had been rebuilt. Nehemiah 7 verse 4. Jerusalem needed a lot of work. A few months after receiving the troubling report, sometime during the month of Nisan, which was in Artaxerxes' 20th year, Nehemiah asked for and received permission to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls in the city. Artaxerxes gave him letters allowing passage through the empire and for gathering resources needed for the construction of the gates and wall. Nothing is mentioned about his actual journey to Jerusalem, though, and an unspecified time gap occurs between verses 8 and 9 in chapter 1. Although a year is mentioned, there is no date of the month given when this request occurred. In other biblical narratives, if the writer thought the specific date was important, then it was included. In this case, are we to assume that the exact day of the decree is not important? Some further investigation is needed to determine when the rebuilding of Jerusalem began, since this is the stated purpose of the 62 weeks. Following his request of Artaxerxes, Nehemiah's next mentioned date is of the completion of the wall of Jerusalem. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul, in 52 days. Nehemiah 6 verse 15. Elul is the 6th month of the Jewish calendar, roughly the end of September. Counting back 52 days from that point, the construction of the wall began on the 3rd day of Av. Nehemiah 2:9 states that when he arrived in Jerusalem at least 3 days before the start of construction, in the 29th of Tammuz, roughly mid-August. When we examine the calendar dates of 444 BC recorded in the Babylonian chronology, the month of Nisan occurred in early to mid-April. Is it likely that Nehemiah could have procured the needed building resources, prepared a new group of Jewish settlers, journeyed with a large caravan several hundred miles west, and met with all the governors of the surrounding region, all within the time period of at most 3.5 months? There is another similar journey of returning exiles during that period, which is described in the Bible, in Ezra 7. There it states, "And there went up also to Jerusalem in the 7th year of Artaxerxes the king, some of the people of Israel, and some of the priests and Levites, the singers and gatekeepers, and the temple servants. And Ezra came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was in the 7th year of the king. For on the 1st day of the 1st month he began to go up from Babylonia. And on the 1st day of the 5th month he came to Jerusalem, for the good hand of his God was on him." Ezra describes his journey starting in Babylon on Nisan 1 and arriving in Jerusalem on Av the 1st. Just the journey itself took 4 months, and he implies that he made very good time. Nehemiah, on the other hand, had to begin his journey in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, and not from Babylon. This would be a further 200 miles away to the east. It is therefore doubtful that the rebuilding could have occurred in the same year as Artaxerxes' decree. There is another account describing Nehemiah's time, written by historian Josephus, who wrote in the 1st century AD. There he states, "Now, when he was come to Babylon, and he had taken with him many of his countrymen who voluntarily followed him, he came to Jerusalem in the 25th year of the reign of Xerxes." Taking into account what Josephus records, there occurred a gap of 4 years between the issuing of the decree and the time when Jerusalem began to be rebuilt. 440 BC should be considered the start of the 62 weeks. So 440 BC plus 434 years, that is 62 weeks times 7, ends up at 6 BC. 6 BC is a highly significant date and could very well be the birth year of Jesus Christ. We'll consider this shortly. But if it is true that 440 BC is the start of the second group, then the gap between the first and the second group, remember an unstated gap, is 98 years. This also happens to be a group of weeks, 14 weeks of years. This is the pattern that Daniel saw as Gabriel laid it out for him. It is also what was specifically instructed to seal up so that it remained hidden until the time was right. One more thing needs to be pointed out about those who use the King James Version and combine the 7 weeks with the 62 weeks. They have no obvious explanation for why the weeks are separated out in the first place. A common explanation is that the 7 weeks describes how long Jerusalem took to rebuild. But that is simply ignorance of historical facts. The reconstruction work of Jerusalem and the temple went through many phases. The walls were actually torn down and rebuilt a couple of times over the following centuries. The historian Josephus includes many of these details. During the time of Antiochus, Jerusalem was severely attacked. And when he, Antiochus, had pillaged the whole city, which was Jerusalem, some of the inhabitants he slew, and some he carried captive, together with their wives and children, so that the multitude of those captives that were taken alive amounted to about 10,000. He also burnt down the finest buildings, and when he had overthrown the city walls, he built a citadel in the lower part of the city, for the place was high and overlooked the temple, on which account he fortified it with high walls and towers, and put into it a garrison of Macedonians. In another account, it says, Judas also rebuilt the walls round about the city, and reared towers of great height against the incursions of enemies, and set guards therein. And elsewhere, they went out of the temple, but when Antiochus came into it and saw how strong the place was, he broke his oaths, and ordered his army that was there to pluck down the walls to the ground. And when he had so done, he returned to Antioch. Now later, I, Alexander the son of Antiochus Epiphanes, also give you leave to repair and rebuild your temple, and that all will be done by my expenses. I also allow you to build the walls of your city, and to erect high towers. Some time after this, when Alexander, the son of Aristobulus, made an incursion into Judea, Gabinius came from Rome into Syria as commander of the Roman forces. He did many considerable actions, and particularly made war with Alexander, since Hyrcanus was not yet able to oppose his power, but was already attempting to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, which Pompey had overthrown, although the Romans, which were there, restrained him from that his design. So as you can see, the period of the 62 weeks really was a period of troublous times, and was much longer than just the 7 weeks of years. In fact, it lasted the entire 62 weeks of years. The period of 62 weeks, or 434 years, started counting down at the point when Jerusalem walls and inner city began to be rebuilt. Not the year that the decree was given by Artaxerxes. That is not what the prophecy says. It is the period of time specifically for rebuilding the city. And this was in 440 BC. 434 years later, and the period ends in 6 BC. This was a significant year. It was so significant that a group of learned Magi began a quest to find the Jewish Messiah. They realized that the time was at hand because, as the 70 weeks prophecy states, after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off. The time of the Messiah's arrival was at hand. Even though there are no definitive historical documents stating that Jesus Christ was born in 6 BC, there are several very interesting evidences. The first is an early Christian assumption that the birth year was in 304 Anno Alexandri. People of the time had multiple ways to mark off significant years. Due to the fact that the Greek language and culture were as ubiquitous through the entire region as English is in today's culture, many people counted years based on Greek history. When Alexander the Great died, the empire he had established split up. The Seleucid era dating begins from around 311-310 BC. Since early Christians held the year of 304 as the date of the birth, that means between 7 and 6 BC is the year of significance. This information is found in Al-Biruni's writings, where he states, further, Jews and Christians unanimously support that the birth of Jesus the Son of Mary took place Anno Alexandri 304. Second, the star in the night sky that Matthew talks about has been investigated by many people. One of the best researched theories comes from Molnar in his book, The Star of Bethlehem. His research shows that very significant events in the night sky occurred in 6 BC, which would have been extremely significant to the astronomers of the time. Specific regions were associated with a certain astrological sign. The sign of Aries was associated with the region of Syria and Judea. On April 17, 6 BC, Jupiter, as the regal planet, was occulted by and emerged from behind the moon. This was exactly at the time when Jupiter rose above the eastern horizon within the sign of Aries and was located there along with Saturn and the Sun and the Moon. At that time, Jupiter began to slow its movement through the sky until it stopped completely on August 23rd. It displayed retrograde motion. From that point, it began to reverse its direction and again moved into the sign of Aries. It continued for several months and again stopped on December 19th when it reversed and continued on in the normal direction. These behaviors would have been extremely significant signs in the heavens for those who had been waiting for this particular significant year. We could also discuss the death of Herod because he factors into the narrative as well. Others have gone into this area in great detail, but suffice to say, there is enough evidence that Herod's death occurred in 4 BC, which would have given enough time for him to give the order to kill all the male children throughout the region 2 years old and younger. And the final evidence, and arguably the most significant, but not at all well known, is the evidence of the Eclipse Event Sign, which points to 6 BC. I introduced this topic in my presentation, The Date Hidden from History. God has set up the relationships between the Earth, Moon, and Sun, and the various eclipses that result, so that at certain special events in history, they are marked with a grouping of eclipses. Since the Jewish festivals and new months are tied to new moon and full moon, eclipses occur with relative frequency on those dates. God seems to mark extra special events in the history of the Jewish people. In the year of the event, the start of several eclipses during these festivals begins. and continues for 2 to 3 years afterward. There is no set number. However, it does seem that the greater the number of eclipses in the group, the greater the significance of that historical event. Also, if there are a greater number of solar eclipses, it seems that signifies an especially significant time of judgment for the Jewish people. However, not all groups of eclipses are significant. One cannot use this to foretell the future. Only after the fact does it become obvious that a significant event has been marked by eclipses in the heavens. In the year 6 BC, there is the start of one such grouping of eclipses on Jewish feast days. What is especially notable is that this is the only time during that particular decade that a group of eclipses matched Jewish feast days. Much more will be said about this subject in the next presentation. Many of the start and end points of the 70 weeks time periods have been marked with eclipse event signs. And this investigation will lead to some very significant expected patterns in the future, ones that are rapidly approaching.